Welcome to Wearing History. Today we're doing part 2 of the 1939 wrap dress. This is doing the alterations and sewing the bodice. Go back and watch the first video for standard alterations if you haven't already. So in addition to the alterations I did last time, I'm going to be adjusting the back for more coverage so it'll cover my bra. If you want to do this, tape a piece of paper along that back length. As you can see, I do have a couple other alterations I did in the last video, which were shortening the waist and raising the underarm. So you can see those in the last video. I'm adding now to the bottom of the back, so I'm drawing my new fold line first, and then from there I'm drawing my new cut line. I've moved it over about 1.5 inches from where it was. Then I'm going to be marking what I've done and drawing a new center back line. After this, I'm cutting off the extra paper. I'll now fold under that seam where it laps. This is the fold line on the pattern for your facing. And then I will use my scissors and I will cut the line there at the bottom so that I know where it's going to turn back, and also up at the top of the shoulder. And this just trues up the pattern so that the overlap is correct. And like I said, I marked center back line, and now I'm moving on to scooping out the front armhole. I noticed because of my posture, I need to scoop out some of the front because I'm a little bit slunched over, which is very, very common for these days. So I am redrawing a curve for the front armhole. Before this, of course, you have to tape the dart closed so you have a nice smooth line. And I showed this again in the last video for raising the armhole. Now I am cutting that open, and there's my new dart shape. So now I'm just going to draw my seam allowance for my pattern so I know exactly where my changes are. The seam allowance for this pattern are 3/8 of an inch. So I'm drawing this, and then at the intersection I'm marking a dot so I know where my new dart starts and ends. Now I'm going to true up the dart shape a little bit because it got a little bit wonky in there. I probably should have had a little bit more paper underneath because the point would have extended a little bit longer. I'm just going to keep that in mind when I cut my final fabric. So truing that up, and it looks really good. I'm going to test it now to make sure it lays right, and it does, so we can move on. Now I have cut it out of my fabric, and I'm going to be marking the critical points now. I'm using a fabric pen. You can see that I've cut the pattern there to have the curve so I can draw the curve with the pen. Before doing any of this, test it on your fabric to make sure it comes out in the wash. This one comes out with water for mine, so it's really easy. If it doesn't work for you, try chalk or thread marking or whatever you need for your fabric. So I'm doing my notches, I'm marking my darts, I'm marking the ends of the darts, I'm marking the pocket, and I'm marking the center front. Now I'm taking my chalk, and you can get a pin like this either in the Sewing Notions section or in the quilting section of a fabric store or online. And I am truing up my darts and marking them exactly where they're going to go. This particular fabric, even though it's linen, can be a little bit wiggly because it's lightweight. So I am marking it exactly where everything should be, and I'm being very careful in my construction process that things don't distort, which can happen with a lighter weight or flowy fabric. So now I'm marking the other side, so I'm doing my darts. There's my little snips for the end of my dart, marking it up to the dot, and a little bit of a breeze, marking my underarm dart right there, the side bust dart, and I'm marking my center front. The center fronts and center backs are super important for this pattern. Make sure you mark these. They're very important for attaching the belt. Now I'm going to thread mark the center fronts. I'm using a contrasting thread, and I'm just going to remember where it's going to be. So doing the thread marking, you're going to just run big basting stitches with a contrasting thread. That way you can see it both from the right side and the wrong side of the fabric. So when you're lapping it during construction, you can check where everything's supposed to be, and it helps everything to stay exactly where it is. And then when you're finished, you just pull the whole thread out, and no one will ever know it was there. So you're going to be doing this for the center fronts of both of the bodice pieces and the center backs as well. So this is super, super important. Please don't skip this step, or else things might not align how you want. You'll just be super frustrated. So spend a few minutes marking your center fronts and center backs. This is what it looks like from the right side. Now I'm going to add the pocket. The pocket goes on this side, so you can refer to your instructions. So there is one pocket, and I'm marking where the pocket markings are now. And like I said, this pin comes out in the wash. Now this is not included in your instructions, but because my fabric is a little bit wiggly and because that center front of the bodice is on somewhat of a bias, I'm going to be taping my neckline. This is something that you do a lot in more like couture sewing, or we did it in theater a lot. And what you want to do is use a tape that's kind of like a twill tape, something that has no stretch, so that when you have a fabric that is somewhat wiggly and will stretch when it's on the bias, this will stabilize it and make sure that everything stays where it's supposed to. It also really helps with this pattern to not have like it open in the front as you're wearing it. So I'm measuring by hand with my tape right now, right on the inside of that seam line, because you want it to be towards the seam allowance side. You're going to stitch it where no one's even going to see that stitch line. And I'm comparing it first with the pattern, and now I'm cutting two of them so that I know they're exactly the same length. I'm using my pattern instead of the cut fabric piece because the fabric piece can shift when you're cutting it. And this makes sure that it's completely accurate because the pattern is true to how it's supposed to be. I'm now pinning it right on the inside of the seam line that I drew with my chalk. So the seam allowance is 3/8 of an inch, and you can see with my fingers, I'm just moving this into place. I'm starting up at the top of the shoulder, and then I'm going to switch down to the waistline. And you can see I'm doing that here. The seam line should be just on the inside of the seam line so you won't catch the twill tape as you sew that seam. Now I've got a little bit to wiggle in, so I am going to be easing it with my fingers as I pin it up and into place. And anything that you have that's extra, you're just going to ease it in so there's no puckers as you sew this tape in. Now it's pinned, and I'm going to stitch it right there, right on the inside. The tape is a little wide. I found it at a thrift store, so you can use even smaller tape that's more like 1/8 of an inch. And now I'm doing my darts. I'm marking first the point of the dart, and then I'm coming down to where the little snip marks are that I did for the end of the dart. Then I'm easing those into place on the lines that I drew with chalk earlier. So the waistline and the bust line dart are marked. Press the darts towards center front, and then press the bust darts down. Now we're going to be attaching the pocket. If you need more in-depth pocket tutorials, you can find more of those on my channel for different patterns. But we are going to be folding the seam allowance up, and then we're going to be folding the overlap down. Then I'm going to be stitching all the way around the outside edge, so it looks like this. And that is to mark my seam line, and it makes it easier to turn in the curve of the pocket. I've clipped my corners, and now I'm turning them right side out, which finishes the pocket like this. Then I'm going to be top stitching that to place. It looks like that. Now I'm going to be attaching this to the bodice. So I noticed that the top of the pocket is a little bit farther out than the pocket. That may be because they wanted more ease at the top of the pocket, so it stuck out a little bit in the period, but I prefer my pockets to be flat. So I am spacing it evenly between the two, and I noticed that the mark of the curve, the bottom of the pocket, are exactly where they're supposed to be, so I'm being very careful to make sure that those curves match to where my pocket is. I'm starting at the top of the pocket, and then I'm smoothing the fabric down and out, so you want to make sure that it fits really smoothly and fleshly with your fabric. The hardest part are going to be these corners, so use as many pins as you need to. You can see I'm using the tip of the pen to ease in some of the underneath of the pocket so it doesn't try to peek out. Now I'm turning it because it's easier to work that way, and I'm smoothing it again, making sure all the fabric is nice and flat, moving down towards where the corner of the pocket is. And now I'm being very careful to turn under that seam allowance so that it doesn't try to pucker or pull out. The tip of the pen is super helpful for things like this where your finger can't really get in there. So use as many pins as you need to and use them as tools when you have to. After this is pinned, I'm going to be stitching about a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch around the outside using my foot as a guide and back stitching at the top. And that's what it looks like when it's done. Now we're going to finish the front neckline with bias facing. So I have a lot more bias facing tutorials on my blog that you can find, wearinghistoryblog.com. But I'm going to be clipping away the extra seam allowance first from the neckline. And you can leave about 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch. Now I have attached my bias facing there, and I'm going to be turning it towards the wrong side of the garment now. And when it's finished, it looks like that. Now I'm going to be sewing this by hand to place because I don't want any stitch lines visible on my neckline. Now you're going to lap the center fronts. Match center front, lapping it exactly like this. You can refer to your pattern directions for which direction to lap it. And you're going to pin that into place, making sure that it lays nice and smoothly. If you've made any alterations to your bodice, you're going to want to recheck where your center front is, because it can affect where it lays at the neckline. I'm now lapping them one over the other, and I'm matching those lines. You can see why it's so important to mark those. And I'm going to just tack this to place with a little bit of thread at the neckline. And when you try this on, you can see if you need to adjust this. You may need to wiggle it wherever you need the lap to be, but this will prevent any bra peekage at the front. Okay, so now it's stitched to place. Now I'm going to be gathering my shoulders. So gather your shoulders. Now we're going to work on the back of the bodice. The back of the bodice is very similar to the front in the terms of the marking that you're going to need to do, but there's a lot less that you need to do to prep the back bodice. So I'm going to be doing my darts now, starting at the point, working down to the snips, just like on the front bodice, then easing that into place. And you're going to stitch these and press them towards center back. And again, very critical is marking the center back of the bodice. You're really going to want to do this and then thread mark it like you did with the front. Next, we're going to tape the neckline. This is optional because it is more on the straight grain of the fabric than the front, so it's not as likely to stretch out, but I figured I'd do it anyways. So I am marking the overlap now where the fold line is of the back of the bodice, and I have also stitched 3/8 of an inch from the cut edge of the fabric, and that is where you're going to turn it under for the overlap. So now I'm measuring on the bodice just like I did before, right on the inside of the fold line, and seeing how long it needs to be. Again, the fabric can distort as you're cutting it, so this is just to make sure it's completely accurate like the trued pattern is. So cut your lengths, 2 of them exactly the same. Then lay it just on the inside of the chalk line that you marked, so that you will not catch it with stitching. Pin it to place, then stitch it, just like with the last time. Turn under that raw edge 3/8 of an inch, then turn it under again on the line that was marked. It should be like this when it's done, so none of the machine stitching is visible. Now before you stitch that to place, we're going to be matching the shoulder seams. Match the shoulder seams together. You're going to do the finished edge of the front right to the snip there that you should have made for the flap of the back. So that makes sure that that will be encased in a future step. Match your notches, and remember 3/8 of an inch seam allowance for this. And then between the notch and the edge there, you're going to pull this gathering in. So grab both threads and then pull it into place, easing the gathering smoothly and evenly across. Most of it will be focused between the notch and where the turn under is of the bias of the front. Stitch that with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Stop at the edge of the front bodice. Now I'm going to be doing the side seams. The side seams can be a little bit fussy, so make sure that you take your time to pin it well. One of them is more on straight grain, one of them is more on bias, so it will take some easing to get them to lay nicely together. You also are supposed to leave a little bit free above the side seam there, so about 3/8 of an inch from the cut edge of the underarm seam, leave that free, and that will make it a lot easier to do your bias in a future step. Sew these with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, then press the seam open on the side, and the seam should be going towards the back on the shoulder. Now we're going to finish the back neckline. To do this, you're just going to turn it in like this, and you can see that that will encase that seam and make a nice clean finish for the neckline. Pin this to place all the way down, and then you're going to stitch that by hand or machine. I chose hand stitching for my particular one because I didn't want any visible stitching. This is it for prepping the bodice for this particular video. I'm going to continue in a future video. I decided to do the whole armhole seam in a different one using bias facing because I wanted to try my bodice on and make sure the underarm seams were right in the final fabric before I chose to do the bias facing on the underarm. So we will go through that in a future step. Please keep your eye out for more videos for this particular pattern. You can find my patterns on wearinghistorypatterns.com or Wearing History on Etsy. Thanks so much for watching.